Tonight, we are here to learn about immigration law and how it could soon be changing. From Wayne State law professor Jonathan Weinberg. Weinberg will take your questions at the end, but cannot offer personal law advice. Okay. Professor Weinberg has been a law clerk to the U.S. Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall and then Judge Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a visiting scholar at the University of Tokyo's Institute of Journalism and Communication Studies, a legal scholar in residence at the FCC's Office of Plans and Policy, a visiting scholar at the Cardozo Law School in New York, and a professor in residence at the U.S. Justice Department. He holds a JD from the Columbia Law School and an AB from Harvard University. So please give Professor Weinberg a warm welcome.
I told the folks tonight that I would talk to you about where immigration law currently stands, how it could be changing. That's in fact just a huge topic, one calling for a bunch of background, so I'm going to get started. If I say stuff that isn't clear or if I say stuff that loses anyone, it's completely fine to interrupt with questions. But I'm fairly confident that folks will leave this evening knowing more than when they came in. Really, two big things we could be talking about here. First, legal migration, migration that accords with the rules, and illegal or unauthorized migration. That's migration that accords that doesn't. I'm going to start with the first one, and then we're going to move on afterwards to the second. And in order to tell you about legal migration, I'm going to give you a really fast, potted history of immigration and immigration law in the US from the beginning. This is obviously really summary, it's really selective, but I'm going to need it to make a couple of key points. And the first key point is that we didn't always have immigration law. Before 1870, there were no federal restrictions in immigration except for the 1808 ban on the slave trade. There was, from time to time in the 1800s, a bunch of prejudice, racism directed at new immigrants. In particular, thinking of prejudice directed at the Irish in the mid-1800s. And there were nativist anti-immigrant movements during some of that period, but none of that ended up getting translated into law. Basic rule of that period, rather, was that anybody who wanted to come to the US could come. You got on the boat, showed up, end of story, no legal mechanisms to stop you. What first changed that was prejudice against the Chinese. And anti-Chinese prejudice was a really huge deal in the late 19th century, in particular on the West Coast. We had nativists who were unhappy with the Chinese immigrant presence, engaging in pogroms, arson, mass violence. State legislators passed anti-Chinese laws. Overall, not a pretty picture. And Congress gets in on the act with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. So this is the first US large-scale restriction on immigration. It bans the immigration to the US of any folks from China other than a few elite merchants. This is followed by a 1907 agreement with Japan, barring immigration, or pretty much barring immigration from that country. 1917, Congress passes a law banning entry from folks from most of the rest of Asia. With all that in place, though, until the 1920s, so for the first 150 years of our nation's history, until the 1920s, there were no significant legal restrictions at all on the ability of a white person anywhere in the world to move here. Sometimes when people are talking about immigration law, you'll see somebody mentioning that his family came here illegally. Well, if that person's not Asian and his family came here before the 1920s, Then, of course, they came here legally, because before the 20s, if you were an Asian and you weren't what the statute so quaintly referred to as a lunatic, an idiot, or a convict, you just came, and nobody was going to stop you. So the big change there, the big thing that upsets that, is the National Origins Act of 1924. And in that sense, the National Origins Act of 1924 is in some sense where modern immigration law begins for white people. And what's driving that is that immigration to this country before the late 1800s comes primarily from Northern and Western Europe. But that changes over time. From about 1890, the beginning of the First World War, what we're seeing is a whole lot of immigration to this country from Southern and Eastern Europe. So that's when my own grandparents came to this country from Lithuania and Poland. And the new immigrants, in particular Italians and Jews, are met with a huge amount of prejudice from the Northern and Western Europeans who are running the country. They see Southern and Eastern Europeans as mentally and physically inferior, and moreover, unassimilable. There is no way those guys are going to become Americans like us, was the concept. And that's what drives the 1924 Act. And what that law does is it assigns to each country a yearly quota. And so as the numbers work out, Germany gets 15,000 people a year. Great Britain and Ireland together get Germany gets 51,000. Did I say that the first time? Well, if I didn't, I'm saying it now. Germany gets 51,000 people a year. Great Britain and Ireland get 63,000 people a year. So those three countries among them now have 114,000 slots per year. But Russia gets 2,200. Italy gets 3,800 a year. Spain gets 130. Greece gets 100. All of Africa gets 1,200. So under the new plan, in other words, we're not just limiting immigration from Asia. We're allowing in about 140,000 fair-skinned people per year from Northwest Europe and Scandinavia, and about 20,000 people from the entire rest of the world. That's US immigration law for the next 40 years. When it ends is 1965. 1965, pretty much contemporaneously with Congress enacting the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65, Congress enacts the Immigration Act of 1965 that repeals the national origin system. It repeals the ban on immigration from Asia. And under the new system, up to 20,000 people could migrate every year from any given foreign country, no matter what that country was. So that's a big change. On the other hand, there's one thing that the 65 Act doesn't change. And that's the sharp numerical limitation on how many people can come to the US. Because think of this. Before 1924, immigration to the US from non-Asian countries is limited only by the number of people who want to come. There's no cap, there's no quota. After 1924, there are these sharp numerical limits. Once you hit the quota for your country, that's it. We're done. And the 1965 Act retains those sharp limits. They just make them the same for every country. So the 1965 Act then ends up setting up preference categories, which is to say, well, if more people want to come than there's room for under these quotas, who gets in? And the preference categories are supposed to determine who goes to the front of the line every year. So category 1 was something called unmarried adult sons and daughters of US citizens, category 2, and so on. If you didn't fall in one of the preference categories, by virtue of being a close family member of a US citizen or a green card holder or a worker in occupation for which there was insufficient labor supply in the US, refugee from a communist country, well, then you fell into the 8th category, which was basically everybody else. And it becomes clear by 1978 that nobody in the everybody else category is getting in. There are just too many people ahead of them in line. So Congress in 1990 just eliminates the catch-all category. And so what that means, under the post-1990 rules is that, number one, there are yearly limits on immigration to the US from any given country. And number two, without regard to those, you can't come in unless you fall into one of the family reunification-based or employment-based categories set out in the statute. And these things work in combination, so that even if you do fall into one of those categories, you may have to wait a long time before you reach the head of the line. As it happens, as things have worked out, the way Congress set up the numbers, most of immigration to the US is family-based migration. That's new people coming into this country, migrating, getting green cards. The vast majority of them are getting them because they fall into one of the family-based categories under the statute. And you know, that's not really necessarily anything to be surprised at. That sort of mirrors the way things have pretty much worked in the US for the past 200 years, starting before we started doing immigration regulation. You know, people have made the trek to the US to join their family members. One person would make the move first. Later on, he'd be joined by a spouse or a parent or a brother or a sister. Branch of my family tree I know best. My great-grandfather here moves here first, back before the 1924 Act, when immigration from Europe is unrestricted. Once he gets settled, he sends for his wife and their kids to join him. That includes my grandfather. How it traditionally worked. And specifically, the way that works today is this. Number one, for family-based migration, number one, if you're a citizen or a green card holder, you can sponsor your husband or your wife or your child. Depending on on who you are, what your relationship is, how many people there already are in the queue in front of you from that country, that person may be able to enter quickly, or there may be a wait. And the wait may be a long wait. So that, for example, the waiting list for a person who's trying to enter as the adult son or daughter of a US citizen, right now that list's more than 20 years long. If you're a US citizen and you're over 21, you can also sponsor your mom or dad, or a brother or a sister. Your mom or dad can enter pretty quickly, usually. But a person seeking to enter the US as the brother or sister of a US citizen is looking at right now a 14 to 24-year wait after his application is approved. And whether it's 14 or 24 or somewhere in the middle is, again, just depending on what part of the country he's coming from, because some countries with higher immigration to the US are by virtue of that going to have more crowded waiting lists. So anyway, that's basically the shape of the legal migration system we have now. There are other immigration categories. Some people do come in on an employment basis because they're being hired to fill a job for which the employer can't find US workers. Some folks come as refugees fleeing persecution in a foreign country on account of their race, religion, national origin, and so on. But in fact, family-based migration is the biggest part of it. The legal immigration rules have gotten a lot of attention recently because President Trump has been pushing in a variety of ways to change our legal immigration rules. And the three biggest things to look at there are, number one, immigration from a bunch of majority Muslim countries. Number two, what the president calls chain migration. And number three, the visa lottery. So I'm just going to run through those one at a time. Number one, just a couple weeks after the inauguration, the administration announces a ban on legal entry to the US for anybody from any of 7 majority Muslim countries. That ban ends up being challenged in the courts right away. It goes through a variety of changes. The administration ultimately pulls it and issues a new revised version, and then a new revised version of that. The most recent version is going to be considered by the Supreme Court later this year. And so the current version, indeed, bars all immigration to the US from Chad, Iran, Libya, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen. If you're there are aspects of that that are slightly more complicated, but that's going to work for us right now in this context. When the case gets to the Supreme Court is going to consider three main issues that have been raised in challenges. Number one, is this ban the product of bias against Muslims on the president's part that makes it unconstitutional? In a whole variety of contexts, the US federal government isn't allowed to take actions motivated by animus toward particular religions. Second, President basically did this on his own without any authorization from Congress. So the question's going to be, does the immigration law give the president the power to implement this ban unilaterally? Or can only Congress do that? And the third question, does this ban, if kept in place, basically take us back to our pre-1965 national origin system, under which we had countries we like and countries we don't like, and we only accept immigrants from countries we like, with the people we like? And if that's right, that's potentially a problem, because there's a pretty explicit provision in the immigration statute saying we don't do that anymore post-1965. Lower courts, in fact, have ruled against the administration on all three of those questions, but the Supreme Court may have its own ideas, and we'll just have to wait to see how that comes out. I seem to have, can't trust me, I just break the microphone. It'll go back in. So, yeah.
On the ban, is that inclusive of the H-1s and the employment-based applications? So no matter what you're trying to, no matter why you're trying to get in, the ban is covered. Is that correct? No.
Sort of is the answer. So basically, the big distinction that we want to be thinking about here is between people who come into the U.S. on temporary visas for limited periods of time and people who are admitted here to live basically for good. The original ban that was issued by the administration right after the inauguration pretty much said nobody under any circumstances with any kind of visa, period. And as they've moved along and they've gotten a bit more nuanced and subtle, what the latest document says is that for those countries, there's going to be no entry for permanent visas, for green card visas. And there are strict limitations on temporary visas like the H-1B. But exactly what those limitations are actually varies from country to country. So Sudan has one regime, and Somalia has a different regime, and Iran has a third, and so on. So there's still room for some entry on temporary visas for some folks, but it's still a highly restrictive regime. And something that's worth keeping in mind here is that lawyers tend to pay a lot of attention to these executive orders and the bans they embody because they're big and dramatic and they raise big constitutional and other issues like, can the president take action based on religious animus? Fact is, though, that the administration, even aside from this, has been really successful at largely shutting down migration from a wide range of majority Muslim countries simply by imposing a lot of really time-consuming and opaque security screening requirements, and incidentally cutting the staff who would otherwise be processing the security screening. So you can't get security screened because the one guy who's doing it is 500 people behind you in the queue. And that's nothing the Supreme Court says about the executive orders is going to change that. So for right now, at least, that's our first topic on changes to legal migration, and that's the one that's been implemented. We've got two others that are proposed. Second one is that President Trump has recently, in particular, and very loudly, been urging Congress to fundamentally rewrite the immigration law to eliminate what the White House is calling chain migration, which is basically what everybody else calls family-based migration. The idea, in essence, is that we ought to be admitting only the bare minimum of immigrants who are not wealthy, highly educated, highly skilled. Family-based immigrants are not necessarily highly educated and highly skilled. Some are, some aren't. And so the White House in particular is urging that Congress rewrite the law so that parents or siblings or adult children of US citizens and green card holders would no longer be eligible to immigrate at all, not even after a 20-year wait. And this is sort of ironic, I guess, since if it had been in place when, say, President Trump's family came to this country, neither his dad's parents, who immigrated from Germany, nor his mom, who immigrated from Scotland, would in fact have been allowed to enter. Since President Trump's mom was unskilled and unemployed when she arrived here from Scotland, and so she moved in with her older sister, who had come to the US before her. His paternal grandfather came here from Germany and moved in with his older sister and her husband. And that's a pretty ordinary American family history. That's just how it was done in zillions, to use the technical term, of American families. But I think it points up the way in which ordinary family-based migration has given us the sort of people who built this country since it was founded. And in fact, I think this proposal from the president is basically DOA in Congress. It's not going to be enacted. It would eliminate categories of migration that currently amount to about a quarter of all legal immigration to the US today. And my read, at least, is that that sort of change just isn't acceptable to a majority of members of Congress. Third item is another,
You state that all these people didn't came because their families came. But they had skills. They were draftsmen. They were whatever in their countries. They may not have spoke perfect English, but they had skills.
Well, like today, some people had skills, some people didn't. People who migrated to the US, they were pretty much, in that respect, like people seeking to migrate to the US today. Many of them, a great many of them, didn't speak English at all. Back in the early 1900s, actually, there was a push by nativists in Congress to require that folks migrating to the US be able to speak English, because it was felt, or indeed be literate in English, because it was felt that this would greatly restrict migration. And those proposals were never enacted. The one thing that did get written into the law sometime around 1910 or so was the requirement that people migrating to the US be literate in their own language. So we saw things like, in Italy in particular, there were schools set up to teach people how to read and write. And this is to teach people how to read and write Italian so that they could migrate to the US. Because in Italy and in a whole lot of countries at the time, migration was a boon to the sending country as well as the receiving country, People would come to the US, they would make money, they would send it to their relatives at home. There was a certain amount of circular migration. People would come to the US, they would make money for a while, they would move back. Both of those are also true of immigration today. But a huge amount of the immigration of the time was of people who spoke no English, people who were barely literate in their own language, but who, and I'm going to go on the limb and say this, had in common that they were brave because they were willing to cross an ocean and come to some entirely new place where they'd never been before, where they didn't speak the language, and try and make a new life, with the support of, to the extent they had it, of their relatives, of their landsmen, which was in that generation in certain communities the word for people from the same town who you could look on to support you, but still a very scary thing. And that's largely true also of immigrants today. Yeah. I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
I wanted to ask one thing about what they were trying to add in about speaking English. It's in our Constitution that we will never have an official language.
Could you repeat the question?
That's where I've got a problem with it. It says we're never really going to have an official language. How can we say that's going to be English?
Well, in fact, I think the Constitution doesn't say that. Although I agree with you, and I don't think there's any.
But isn't that part of citizenship? To apply and to get citizenship, you have to be able to understand English?
Absolutely right. In order to become a citizen, in order to become a U.S. citizen, you need to be able to understand English. You need to be able to read and write English to a limited degree. On the other hand, the way this worked in the early part of the 19th century is that people would come to the US speaking no English, because after all, how are they supposed to learn English in Białystok? How are they supposed to learn English in Ravenna? Not going to happen. But they come to the US and they learn English, or they come to the US and they don't learn English, but their kids learn English, and after one learned English, one could become a citizen. The folks back in 1910 who were saying, well, we don't want anyone here unless they speak English already, were doing it pretty explicitly, because if we didn't let people in unless they spoke English already, then that shuts out everybody who's trying to come in from Białystok. That shuts out everyone who's trying to come in from Sicily. That shuts out everyone who's trying to come in from North Africa, which there weren't so many of back then. And that was defeated for a time, although in fact those folks won in 1924 when we enacted the National Origins Act, and we used a different tool to shut out any of the Jews and Italians who hadn't yet made it over. There was actually some illegal migration post-1924. If you read the Saturday Evening Post of 1930-ish, you can see the folks wringing their hands about illegal migration and violation of the National Origins Act. So in that sense, there really is nothing new under the sun. Yeah.
The woman's question kind of sparks something in my brain, and that is, immigration doesn't necessarily mean an intention to become a citizen. Is there any sense of the legal immigrants, what percentage end up becoming citizens?
Well, so
Because that's not required.
it's not required. It tends to vary with circumstance to circumstance and country to country. There are a lot of people who come to the U.S. and become citizens as soon as possible. Other people not, for a variety of reasons. Some people say, well, things are good, why is this necessary? And after all, it's expensive. It's like $800. there's a test and you have to study. Not everyone's cool with that. Some people are emotionally conflicted about becoming citizens. They say, well, gee, does this mean that I'm not Mexican anymore? And how do I feel about that? Why can't I be both? And so, in fact, naturalization rates vary a lot from cohort to cohort and from country to country. Something we're seeing now is that there is one very important potential consequence of becoming a citizen, which is that if you're in the US and you're not a citizen, that means that you're potentially at risk of being deported, because non-citizens can be kicked out and citizens can't. And that's especially relevant if you are or ever have been or anticipate someday being a teenager. Because teenagers do stupid things. And sometimes when teenagers do stupid things, this means they wind up with convictions on their record. And the convictions on their records can be grounds for deportation in some cases. And here I'm getting ahead of our story. You might have read about Lucas Neese, who's a doctor in Kalamazoo. He's 43. He works at the 3 Bronson hospitals in Kalamazoo. He's got a wife he just married. He's got a 12-year-old stepdaughter. He's currently in deportation proceedings, primarily because of 2 misdemeanors he committed when he was a teenager. And that wasn't anything that seemed to bother the immigration authorities before 2017, but it is now. But I want to come back to that because I got a whole another spiel prepared for you on illegal immigration. We don't want to skip right over it. One more thing I do want to mention: the third change that the president suggested in legal migration relates to something called the diversity lottery. And this is a program that was begun actually in the mid-1980s to allocate a small number of visas on a lottery basis to applicants from countries that otherwise have low levels of migration to the US. It was actually originally started in large part as an avenue for additional visas from Ireland. Does it work that way today? Today, diversity lottery winners are largely from Africa and Central Asia. As it turns out, near as we can tell, diversity visa winners are in fact rather better educated than the general American population. It looks as if half of them have bachelor's degrees, which is more than Americans as a whole. But the diversity visa does not have a strong constituency in Congress. And so there's a good chance that the Congress and the president end up doing any kind of deal on immigration. That one's going to go. And that will make the incoming immigration pool at least a smidge wider, which is consistent with the president's expressed desire for more immigrants from places like Norway and fewer from what he calls the S-hole countries. But yeah.
What's the quantity for the current limits, and was that set in law? Like how many visas, can be issued? And is that a law or is that just a policy?
No, that with exceptions not worth getting into, that's set in law. That's actually written into the statute. So the diversity program basically is 50,000 people a year, and that's what it is because that's what Congress said it would be.
How about the
Overall, migration to the U.S. on permanent visas is pretty close to 1 million people a year. That's a round number, and that's a lot of people. About, I think,
And that's in law? Is that in law, that quantity?
I'm going to say yes. It's slightly more complicated, but yes is good enough for our purposes. But it's not, I think it's not within the power of the administration unilaterally to lower those numbers. They have to go to Congress and get Congress to amend the law. Yeah.
So what is considered good immigration law as compared to other countries? What do other countries do?
Well, different countries do different things. I think one of the key questions here is the question that was raised, relates to the question that was just raised about the numbers. How many immigrants do we think ought to be coming in the U.S., say, in a given year? And one could argue that roughly 1 million is the right number. One could argue, and some people make this argument, that 1 million is too high. We should let in fewer immigrants. One could argue that the volume of illegal immigration proves that 1 million is really too low. And I'll get to that in a bit. I think it's probably fair to say that compared to most other countries in the world, the US has high levels of immigration. That if you look at France or Germany or Switzerland, say, those are countries with significantly lower levels of immigration. That's maybe not so surprising, since after all, France and Germany and Switzerland aren't countries that were built on immigration. Aren't countries whose entire population outside of Native Americans are people who either came here from somewhere else or whose parents came here from somewhere else. Other countries don't have the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor saying, give me your tired, your poor, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. So it maybe should not be surprising that we've got different sort of numbers from France. And yeah, wretched refuse. They had no skills. That was Lazarus's point. But if we want to have an immigration law that's more like France and Germany, we would have significantly lower levels of immigration. I want to talk for a sec, though, about illegal migration, because that's another really big part of the picture of what's going on now. We've got about 11 million people who are in this country without authorization. About 70% of them are from Mexico or Central America. And I want to go back to the history on that for just a minute. US and Mexico indeed have a unique history. It's not often you see two countries sharing a 2,000-mile land border with sharply different standards of living. Movement between the two countries dates back to the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Mexico cedes to the U.S. most of the land that's currently, California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, parts of other states, which meant that about 50,000 people found that they had immigrated to the United States without actually having to get out of bed. And at the time, most people aren't paying a lot of attention to the border. After the Chinese Exclusion Acts, after the Chinese Exclusion Acts, by the time we get to the beginning of the 20th century, shut-off of migration from China leads to a labor shortage, because those Chinese workers were working. They were filling jobs. They were working on the railroads. They were working in the mines. Labor shortages end up being filled by contractors who use mostly fraudulent techniques to bring north workers who are tied to the labor contractors to pay off their debts. For the duration of World War I, the US government runs its own worker recruitment program. Down in Mexico, industrialization and land consolidation are forcing most rural households off the land, so there's huge migration to the cities. You get a lot of migration to the US during the Mexican Revolution in the teens. And so the combination of really aggressive demand for labor in this country, for migrant labor in this country, together with economic and political turmoil in Mexico, leads to an explosion of movement across the border in 1910. It reaches its peak in 1924. And most of that migration is seen by the people doing the moving as temporary. They're not coming to the US to stay, just coming over to earn enough money to go back home with. But, then we get into the 1920s. And you all remember by this point what the 1920s were like. It was not a foreigner-friendly time in this country. So we see the formation of the US Border Patrol in 1924. The limitations of the 1924 Act actually didn't apply in the Western Hemisphere. So there were no numerical restrictions on migration from Mexico. But there were a bunch of other tools that were used to limit migration of poor Mexican workers. In particular, strict application of a rule that you couldn't migrate to the US if you were sufficiently poor that you were likely to become a public charge. And so once the Great Depression hits, jobs are scarce. What we see is a campaign of deportations and basically repression that pretty much halves the size of the now unwelcome Mexican population in the US. So then we get to World War I, post-war boom, in World War II rather, and the post-war boom. We need cheap labor again. And the US and Mexican governments in 1942 negotiate something called the Bracero Program for the importation of agricultural workers on temporary visas. It's driven by the need of Mexican workers to generate cash to finance production on the land that they'd receive via agricultural reform programs over there. Huge demand from agricultural growers in Texas and California. It's supplemented by illegal migration outside the Bracero program, which involves less paperwork, especially because the Texas congressional delegation had gotten a provision written into the law that said that US employers couldn't be prosecuted for hiring unauthorized workers. INS border militarization and roundups in the 1950s are pretty successful in moving Mexican agricultural migration out of illegal channels into the Bracero program proper, which by the late 1950s is bringing across the border about 500,000 people a year without a lot of public attention. Workers are basically whisked across the border and taken pretty much directly to the fields. Congress shuts down the Bracero program in 1965. Working conditions of migrant farm workers are deplorable. People, civil rights groups begin to know this. Bureaucracy imposes costs. There's corruption in the system. But the problem is that even though Congress shuts down the Bracero program, growers need workers. They're not willing to go through the sort of pay hikes and working conditions improvements they would need to attract native US workers. And anyway, US workers don't want to do agricultural field work. After 2 decades, when this work's been done nearly exclusively by Mexicans, Americans now see it as, foreign. That's the things that foreigners do. So we've got this huge built-in structural demand for immigrant labor. At the same time, folks in Mexico have gotten used to the money they can earn in the US. They've developed a bunch of social capital and knowledge about what it's like to live and work in the US. Also, the economy over there tanks, and there aren't jobs over there. Except, you'll also remember what I told you about the Immigration Act in 1965. One of the things that does is cut back on the amount of legal migration that's possible for Mexico. As of 1976, Mexico gets put under that 20,000 person a year cap. Well, Mexico is now under a 20,000 person a year cap, but this is the same country that sent more than 400,000 people here every year on temporary visas not too long before. So what happens at that point is the only thing possible, which is a sharp rise in illegal migration, again, mostly temporary, to fill a demand that the Bracero program had used to fill. We have some border enforcement because the nation needs to know that its borders are being defended, but not too much because then the growers wouldn't get their workers. Almost done here, or almost done with the history. I'll get back to the present in a minute. Yeah?
Wasn't there also an event related to corn prices deflating at some point that caused a lot of farmers to seek work in the U.S.?
I don't know. I'm not familiar with that. So the answer is very possibly, but I don't know.
Subsidies in the 70s.
Pardon?
A lot of U.S. subsidies for U.S. farmers and corn prices deflated. So if you're a farmer in Mexico, you couldn't make any money selling corn.
Oh.
That's what I was told.
I believe it, but I don't know about it. So you can trust her, but don't trust me on that. I'm going to fast us forward to 1986 here. Because as of 1986, we're by now at the point where we have had illegal migration across the border, circular migration of migrant labor. There's an increasing sense in the country that the border is out of control. There are growing, highly visible communities of unauthorized Mexican migrants in large U.S. cities, and we're talking about 3 million folks here in the U.S. without authorization, roundabout. So Congress enacts the Immigration Reform and Control Act in 1986, and that statute is designed to solve the unauthorized immigration problem through a three-prong attack. Number one, it sets up a program to legalize long-term unauthorized immigrants, and about 1.5 million people get status that way. It sets up a program to legalize undocumented farm workers, but another million get legal status through that. It pours resources into militarizing the border to make it harder for people to cross the border surreptitiously. And it increases the INS enforcement budget. And the last thing is that for the first time, it makes it, in general, a U.S. federal crime for a U.S. employer to hire a non-citizen unless the employer has done adequate checks to make sure that the non-citizen has what's called work authorization, has some kind of legal status that allows the non-citizen to work, or otherwise has some document issued by the U.S. government saying this person is authorized to work in the U.S. That last bit is actually fairly complicated because we were talking before about temporary visas, and people here on temporary visas are subject to a fairly bewildering array of complicated rules about who exactly is and is not allowed to work in the U.S. But the notion was it was going to be a crime. The notion was it was a crime for an employer to hire someone who was not authorized to work in the U.S., and the concept is, well, that's going to shut off the job spigot, and no one's going to migrate to the U.S. if they can't get a job here. So we're going to solve the unauthorized migration problem. Does it work? And what I mean by it's not working is that, in fact, the population of people in the U.S. without authorization continues getting larger, so that by now it's way, way higher than it was in 1986. Neither of those border closing measures, in fact, stops unauthorized migrants from arriving, and indeed stops employers from hiring them. And in part, that's because Congress, as before, had conflicting motivations and conflicting pressures. On the one hand, Congress wants to show the world that it's cracking down on illegal migration. But employers don't want to be, in fact, at serious risk of serious criminal penalties just because they're hiring unauthorized workers. And the statute that actually gets enacted in 1986 leaves employers in the position where they're pretty safe. And so people keep on coming, employers keep on hiring unauthorized workers. Everybody's happy, at least if you're either an employer or an authorized worker, and leads to the point where, as of now, there are about 11 million people living in the US without authorization. Used to be higher, actually, but the size of the unauthorized population dropped after the recession of 2008 hits, because at that point, jobs really do dry up, and people decide if they're going to be unemployed, they might as well be unemployed back home. Yeah.
This figure of 11 million illegal immigrants, look, we don't do a census of illegal immigrants. A couple of years ago, I was curious about how do we derive this huge figure, and I looked it up. And if there's such a thing as pseudo-math, it's pseudo-math that's being applied to this. We don't go out and count them like we do every 10 years for us.
Well, in fact, two things.
Dubious about this figure.
Two things. In fact, we do our best to count illegal immigrants in the census, because we count all people without regard to their citizenship status. But figures like 11 million aren't coming, in fact, primarily from the US government. We've got some fairly heavy-duty social science work done by folks at the Pew Foundation, by folks at the Migration Policy Institute, and their numbers, at least near as I can tell, are really quite reliable. And when we get different reputable studies done, they seem to converge at roughly the same place. So while it's hard to know these things for sure, right now 11.4 million seems to be a pretty good guesstimate. At least it's good enough for our purposes here. Yeah.
I was wondering, we're talking apples and oranges, it sounds like. 1950 to right now, the population was 115 million versus 226 million. The population was growing and the country was growing back then, so we needed immigrants and migrants at that particular time. At what particular number do you think we should stop? I'm going to put you on the spot.
What number we should stop admitting immigrants? Well, I am gonna say, as a guy who is, so I'm 59, which puts me in the same, roughly speaking, the same generational cohort as a lot of people in this room. And seems to me that when my generation hits retirement age, I would just assume there'd be a lot of younger people in this country working. And so, yeah, I think we could use some young, hardworking folks in the country creating the gross national product that's going to support all of the rest of us when we're on Social Security.
They sent that money back home.
Right. Well,
Money back home, they don't pay taxes.
sure they do. Well, a lot of us don't pay taxes either, but near as I can tell, first problem here is that, most of us, of course, pay taxes through wage withholding. And if I'm here without authorization and I get a job the way most people get here without authorization, get a job, which is to say by ginning up a fake Social Security number and a fake document, well, that means, I'm getting my income tax withheld. I'm getting my Social Security withheld. All that money is going straight into federal government coffers. I'm not getting the benefit of it. I can't actually collect that Social Security when I get old, so it's not a very good deal for me in that sense. On the other hand, it's not a very good deal for me, the hypothetical unauthorized migrant. It is a good deal for me, the law professor, because the Social Security system is enriched by the contributions of the poor schmo who's never going to be able to get the payout. Yeah.
How about all the people that are paid under the table?
Well, people are paid under the table, largely in the construction industry and in other areas. Although it's not clear to me, again, that people who are paid under the table in various aspects of the secondary or underground economy are more likely to be unauthorized migrants. The only person I've ever met, who insisted on being paid under the table by me, was a true blue U.S.-born American citizen. I was actually very naive. I went and I said, gee, I feel terrible. We're not making Social Security contributions on your behalf. I'd love to do that. And she said, you do that, I find another job. But anyway. But, pardon?
Can't that, if you don't pay that tax, can't that come back and haunt you?
Well, that's why I wanted to do it. But in any event, we ended up parting ways. So, yeah.
Just to clarify, I asked another question at another immigration forum. I said, well, how are these people getting jobs? You can get a tax identification number with a passport from another country. Just like I worked in Canada on a temporary visa, show my passport, I get a number, and I pay taxes. I'm not going to get anything back. But so there's a lot of immigrants who come into the country, flown in, and are working at jobs and paying taxes.
Although I want to be clear about one thing, which is that a tax identification number is something you can get, and with a tax identification number, you can pay taxes. A tax identification number is not enough to allow you to work legally. If you're in the country without authorization, you haven't got work authorization, you can get a tax ID. You're not going to be able to work unless you either present fake documents, or you're working for someone who's willing to take you without fake documents. But fake documents are cheap and easy, and they're all over the place, and everybody has them. So in fact, in practice, they're not much of a hurdle. A few points just to make here. Number one, I talk about the unauthorized population, these 11 million we're talking about. Who are they? Point one, as of today, about 2/3 of the immigrant population of the unauthorized migrant population in the US have been here for 10 years or more. Only 1 in 7 has lived in the US for less than 5 years. So this is pretty significantly a long-term population. They've got about 4 million US citizen children. Second point, or 2 policy points to make. First one, different participants in the immigration debates have very different views about a whole bunch of things. But I think one thing that everybody agrees on is that having a really large unauthorized population in the country is a bad thing. People disagree as to why. From the point of view of people who from the point of view of immigration restrictionists, it's a bad thing because it manifests disrespect for the rule of law, because it frustrates the policies Congress wrote into the immigration statute about who can come in and who can't. From the point of view of people who want a liberalized immigration policy, it's a bad thing to have 11 million people in the country, who feel they need to live in the shadows, who are at risk of being deported, who are subject to crime and exploitation because they're not able to assert rights under the law. Because they figure if they go to the police, they're going to end up deported. So in that sense, pretty much everybody agrees that this is no way to run a railroad. People disagree as to what to do about it, as to what's the best way to address that problem. Other big policy point here is I mentioned a minute ago that, gee, if you're in the US without authorization, well, you can't work, or at least it's illegal for an employer to hire you without fake documents. Also, you're subject to being deported. But how does that work? Can we actually deport all 11 million people who are here without legal authorization? And the short answer is no. Deporting people takes resources. takes ICE agents to identify and locate the people to be deported. It takes a transportation network to move them. It takes prisons, these days mostly contract prisons run by the private prison industry, to hold them. Most importantly, it takes lawyers and immigration judges, because under the law in general, a person can't be deported without getting a hearing before an immigration judge to make sure that the person really legally is supposed to be deported. So ICE estimated a few years back that in any given year, it had the resources annually to deport fewer than 5% of the people here in the US without authorization. And what that means is that, in the past, Homeland Security necessarily has had to set up priorities, picking and choosing, who it was going to seek to deport, who it was going to allow to stay for the time being. Because naturally, if you can't deport everybody, you need to figure out who your highest priorities are. Sort of much the same way as, when the police department say, well, we're going to pull over the drivers who are 10 or 15 miles an hour over the speed limit, but we're going to get those guys who are 5 miles an hour over drive by. And so over the years, what we've seen is that the Republican and Democratic presidents have used that priority setting in a variety of ways to basically decline to deport people who are illegally in the country, but who they feel it would be dumb to spend their scarce resources deporting. President Reagan's Justice Department gave that protection to more than 150,000 Nicaraguans who are illegally in the country, more than 80,000 Chinese. The administration of the second President Bush did it for thousands of foreign students affected by Hurricane Katrina. In immigration law lingo, this is called giving people, quote unquote, deferred action status. And deferred action status isn't being legal. It doesn't mean you have a right to stay here. But it means that, well, if you have deferred action status, you're not going to be deported for now, because in the eyes of the government, it's got better things to do. And one thing really key about that is that historically, since 1986, that's IRCA, the Work Authorization Statute, when Congress enacted the work authorization law, the administration has given work authorization to people who had deferred action, on the theory that if we're saying, okay, we're not going to deport you, at least not for right now, there's no point in saying, oh, and now you need to starve. If we're letting you stick around by giving you deferred action, at least for the time being, you can also have work authorization and work and make a living and contribute to the community. That's the background for one important thing that happens under the Obama administration, which is that President Obama sets up the so-called DACA program, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And under the DACA program, the so-called dreamers, young people who were brought to this country as children, who grew up here, who have clean criminal records, either are currently in school, have graduated high school, or have served honorably in the US military, that those folks could apply for deferred action status. And the idea here is, basically that as a matter of prosecutorial discretion, it would be a stupid idea to spend taxpayer dollars on deporting the dreamers when we could be using that money on better targets. And deferred action, therefore, meant that this was given in 2-year renewable chunks, that they could feel some assurance that they wouldn't be deported so long as their DACA status lasted, and so long as they kept their noses clean. Also meant they could get work authorization, which meant so an employer could hire them legally. Also meant, as a practical matter, that they could get driver's licenses. And as of this past September, about 700,000 people were DACA recipients. So, yeah.
Why can't they become citizens?
Pardon?
Why don't they have a citizenship?
Well, you can't apply to be a citizen unless you've already got a green card. A green card is admission into the U.S. for lawful permanent residence. And to get a green card, two things need to be true. The first one is that you need to fall into those preference category rules that I was talking about at the beginning of the hour. You need to have the right family relationship with the U.S. citizen, or you need to be hired for a job for which there are no U.S. citizens or green card holders able to do the work. And if you are applying, say, as because you're the brother of a U.S. citizen, that will get you off the line and get you your green card in about 20 years. Then there are other rules that limit one's ability to, even if you satisfy all of those, there are other rules that limit one's ability to get admitted to the U.S. for lawful permanent residence, to get a green card. And in particular, if you have been living in the U.S. under the law for more than a year without authorization, unless you can get some sort of waiver, there is no way you can enter legally unless you leave the country for at least 10 years and then come back. There are some waivers and exceptions to that, but that's the baseline rule. So the answer as to why they don't become citizens is that they can't become citizens unless they can get green cards, and they can't get green cards. And they can't get green cards for a whole bunch of reasons, but at least one of them, the most important of them, is the thing we started out the hour talking about, that we have numerical limits on who can get green cards from a given country, that we restrict those to people who have close family relationships with U.S. citizens or people who are lawfully here who do have green cards. And when we're talking about DACA and we're talking about the Dreamers, we're talking about people who don't have any of that. All they have is a lifetime, minus the first 2 or 3 or 5 years, say, spent living in the U.S., going to school in the U.S., in U.S. communities, working at jobs in the U.S. And then the question becomes, well, how do we want to treat that? The attitude of prior administrations is that those guys, attitude specifically of the Obama administration, is that those guys are deportable because they're here without authorization. There's basically no way for them to legalize their status, and they can be deported at any time. But geez, if we have the ability, if we have the resource to deport 400,000 people a year, say, out of the 11 million who are here now, why in the world would we go after them? We've got bigger fish to fry. We've got a lot of other people who seem less deserving. We might as well leave them alone. And so long as we know we're leaving them alone, why don't we tell them we're leaving them alone and let them keep on doing what they're doing? Go to school, work, have families, contribute to the community. At least that was the attitude of the Obama administration. It didn't make anyone legal, but it gave people, okay, given that we have to pick and choose who we're going to use our resources against, we're going to have it not be you. Yeah?
Could you comment on the legality of the Obama administration executive order creating DACA, where he himself even admitted that it was a purview of Congress to do that and not him, but he went ahead and did it anyway?
Well, in fact, the short version of the comment, short version of the comment is that, yes, in my view, it was unquestionably legal. And Obama, toward the beginning of administration, is speaking off the cuff. He says, I don't think I can do that. And so, among other things, there was a letter signed by about 100 immigration law professors nationwide, which I'm pleased to say I had a very small part in writing, which said, gee, sir, you're a law professor, but you're not an immigration law professor, and we're here to tell you that actually, you know what? You can do this. And the answer is that he can. Because, again, none of this, think through this. number one, we know that not in terms of setting priorities and figuring out, okay, who are we going to go after and who are we not going to go after? Not only does DHS have the power to do that, there is no way DHS can avoid doing it. Even if they say we're not setting priorities, they're implicitly setting priorities because that's what you're doing when you have only a small amount of resources and in some manner or other you're picking who you use them against. So DHS is always going to set priorities and exercise prosecutorial discretion. In conjunction with setting those priorities, DHS has, for decades now, routinely used the tool of deferred action and sometimes used the tool of deferred action in connection with very large groups, groups at least 6 figures in size, if not larger. Deferred action actually first becomes public. Deferred action used to be a tool that the agency used that it didn't really much talk about. It first becomes public in the court battle that ensued when the then Immigration and Naturalization Service tried to deport, some singer named John Lennon, and he sued. And in that lawsuit, we ended up learning a whole lot about DHS's deferred action policies, but that's neither here nor there. So we've got a long history of using deferred action. And we've got a long history of the administration, in fact, not only granting groups deferred action, but indeed granting groups deferred action together with work authorization. The agency has been granting work authorization to people with deferred action since 1986. So it's very, very hard to argue that President Reagan was within the bounds of the law when he grants deferred action and work authorization to 150,000 Nicaraguans who are in the country illegally, but that President Obama, former President Obama, that President Obama is out of bounds when he uses deferred action, when he grants deferred action to something like 800,000 Dreamers who are in the country illegally. I think pretty much it's an exercise of the same authority. Yeah?
Didn't Reagan go to the Congress?
No. I mean, in fact, I think, well, no, the short answer is no. I mean, President Reagan and President Bush did go to Congress for different things at different time points, but not for that. But again, it's not as if, even if any president wanted to, unless Congress is willing to take the entire federal budget, no army, no post office, no social security, we're just going to take all those resources and devote them to deportation. There is no way that this country has the resources to deport everybody. This means that we're only deporting some people. What happened in the DACA program is the same thing that's been happening literally since the 1960s at least, is the administration saying, well, if we're only going to deport some people, let's figure out under those circumstances who we're going to deport and who are at least not going to deport yet. Yeah, all the way in.
Are Dreamers children of illegal immigrants?
Well, Dreamers,
supposedly they were born elsewhere and brought here when they were young. Now, if their parents were a U.S. citizen, this chain link, they would have been granted citizenship, wouldn't they? The Dreamer.
Well, the short answer is that in just about every case, yes. The Dreamers are children who were brought here as children as part of families who were all entering illegally. So yeah. Yeah.
The bigger problem we have is how do we stop it? Let's solve this area, but then and that's what Reagan did, but then he didn't stop and control the border, so now we have more illegals than we had
we don't do something to stop or to control the immigration, then we're gonna have 20 million.
Well, in fact, though, for the past 10 years, the unauthorized population in the U.S. has been flat or declining. The U.S. unauthorized population hit its peak before the recession of 2008, and that was in the neighborhood of 12 to 13 million. It's been either flat or declining pretty steadily since then. So I think wherein that's, unless something important changes, we're not looking at 20,000. Although, again, from my personal perspective, since somebody asked for it a while back.
Because the total number of people immigrating into the United States has been growing every year. Yet you say the illegals have been flat, and the legals are capped at a certain amount from each country. So where are they coming from? They got to be illegal. Or not counted, or they're counted way off.
Okay, so let me make sure I'm responding to what you're asking. We're admitting legal migration at a rate, permanent residents at a rate of about $1 million a year. I misspoke. 1 million people a year. About a rate of about 1 million people a year. Unauthorized migration, according to the best social science we can do, for about the last 10 years, inflows are pretty much matching outflows. And that's consistent with the numbers I quoted you a while back, which is that the unauthorized population in the US is an aging population. 2/3 of those folks have been in the US for 10 years or more. Only about a sixth have been here less than 5 years. Some of that may well be because we do have, at this point, a really robust militarized border presence. President Trump talks about his wall, but if you go down to the border with Mexico, well, we've got, for most of that length, what people in the lingo call a fence. I don't know actually the difference between a fence and the wall. I guess a wall is bigger and more beautiful. But the fence is pretty tall. I've seen pictures, but they're not the sort where I'm going to. But the answer is pretty tall. I mean, designed so that people shouldn't be climbing over it. I mean, that's why it's there.
What I was saying is about 30 feet.
Okay, so there you go.
2, 3 fences, one right after the other. So, I mean, what's the difference between that and the wall?
So in any event, I can't tell you the extent to which declines in unauthorized immigration over the past 10 years are due to the economy, are due to border enforcement, are due to other factors, but it does seem to be the case that the roughly 11 million figure we're at is at or below the figure we've been at for the last decade. And, I said a minute ago I was going to share with you my personal views, which are not necessarily not necessarily what you came to hear, but someone asked a while back. And I saw the figure that I got here, or my grandparents got here, on the lifeboat and climbed up the ladder. And none of my relatives got killed in the Holocaust because we'd been lucky enough to make it to the US before any of that happened, and to make it to the US before 1924 when they closed the doors. And I'm sort of reluctant to turn around after I've climbed up the ladder from the lifeboat into the ship and say, well, okay, you can pull up that ladder now, because I'm on board. I'm not sure that the people who are trying to come to the U.S. today, to make a better life for themselves or for their children, are any less morally deserving, or any less skilled, or any less hardworking, or any less capable of contributing to this country than my grandparents were.
However,
Yeah,
however,
yeah.
as you pointed out several times, your great-grandparents immigrated here perfectly legally.
They immigrated legally because there was no law against it. But you know what? Well, but we have to decide what sort of law we want. If we thought this was a good idea, we could change that law. We could make it easier to come to the US. We could make it easier to legalize your status. The law is what, I don't think the country was improved in 1924 when we decided we were going to keep out all the Italians and the Jews. I think that was a step backwards, not a step forwards. So we got to figure, yeah.
What percentage of the 11.4 would be in this deferred status then? Because if it started with Reagan, if it started with Reagan, how many, and
Well-
then Bush and anybody else who created?
Well, a lot of folks got legalized in 1986. Because in 1986, one of the things we did was take a lot of people who were out of status and actually make them legal green card holders. So as of and indeed one of the big deferred action problems was that after the 1986 law, there were a bunch of folks we hadn't thought about. Basically, we had legalized a bunch of farm workers, and Congress had written the statute so as not to allow a route to legalization for the spouses of the farm workers. And so, in fact, what President Reagan does is he instituted the massive deferred action program for basically farm workers' wives. That when Congress comes along and says, okay, we're going to pass a new statute giving legal status to them. But I don't have numbers. I think by now, one way or another, people who have gotten deferred action early on have made their way out of the pipelines. So we're mostly talking, the biggest group of folks with deferred action now are the 800,000 DACA recipients. And those folks, Natch, are now losing their status because President Trump has ended the DACA program. I mean, folks are maintaining their status for the duration of their 2-year terms of deferred action, but as those terms expire, they're falling out of status, they're losing the work authorization that allows employers to hire them legally, they're becoming subject to deportation. And pretty much what's happening now in Washington is that the White House and congressional Republicans, in particular in the House of Representatives, are seeking to use DACA and the Dreamers as a bargaining chip in a larger negotiation. The trade and continued protection for the Dreamers for things like cuts to family-based migration. I don't think that deal's going to get made. I think the two sides are far apart. What House Republicans are willing to accept, say, and what House Democrats are willing to accept does not have common ground. And so I don't expect the deal is going to get made. I expect that the Senate's going to pass a clean bill extending DACA protection, and that's going to die in the House. And so those folks are going to fall out of status. Yeah?
Could you give us a little background, historical background on Operation Wet Back? I think that's what it was actually called in the Eisenhower administration.
Well, that's pretty much, I think, what it was called. But basically, let me have a second here. Basically, what's going on there is that we started up the Bracero program in 1942. And that's supposed to be the avenue for importation of Mexican temporary agricultural labor into the US. But there's also a lot of migration outside of the Bracero program because the Bracero, in large part because employers, and for that matter, employees, don't want to deal with the paperwork. Employers in particular are saying, screw all that, just come over here and work for us illegally. And what happens during the Eisenhower administration is basically some pretty aggressive enforcement designed to stop any movement of Mexican workers outside of the Bracero program so that everybody is formally in the program. And they can do that because moving from illegal channels to Bracero channels is not so difficult for the worker and for employers if you make it life sufficiently difficult for them to do otherwise. It's hard to compare that to what's going on today because what's going on today is not a choice between legal movement and illegal movement. It's just a choice between no movement and illegal movement. And the no movement is harder to stop.
I read that they deported somewhere between 1 to 3 million, and you can't get a really good number. Not Braceros, illegal. They actually deported between 1 to 3 million. I can't really get a good number. And it was right after the Korean War, servicemen coming back, can't get jobs. But it's kind of sketchy. It's like no one wants to talk about it. You can look it up in Wikipedia, and it's like, can't get good numbers.
So I'm gonna this sounds roughly right, but I'm not going to opine on it because we're getting a little outside my expertise here, and I don't want to talk about stuff I don't actually know. But yeah.
Are you going to get back to the doctor?
Yes.
Well, I mean, I think that's pretty much the story with DACA. There's only one more, in terms of what this administration is changing. The only other thing I'd add is the extent to which this administration, or ICE under this administration, has been hugely aggressive at initiating deportations of folks with well-settled lives in the US who would not have been deportation targets under prior administrations. So I told you the story before, of Dr. Neese, who's being deported largely for crimes he committed. He's 43 when he was a teenager. It's also the case that we've got a variety of folks in the U.S. On what's so-called orders of supervision, which meant that an order of deportation was entered against them at some point in the past, but the INS, or later on ICE, didn't actually think that justice would be served by making them leave. So I said, okay, well, you can stick around and just check in with us periodically so we know who we are, so we know who you are. I mean, there was a well-publicized case recently of a guy named Jorge Garcia in Lincoln Park, who had been in the U.S. nearly 30 years. He'd gotten an order of supervision in 2009 and had regularly been checking in with ICE every 6 months saying, yeah, here I am, I'm keeping my nose clean, I'm raising my family. And ICE says, that's cool. And one of the things that's happening under the current administration is that all of those people are being kicked out, and I can multiply those examples. We had a big issue in the Detroit area recently with Iraqi deportees because we haven't actually deported anybody to Iraq in a really long time because Iraq wouldn't take people. And you can't actually just push somebody out of an airplane. Their country has to be willing to take them back, and that's commonly a matter of international negotiation. So it happened a lot over the decades in the Detroit area that someone from Iraq, would do something dumb, get convicted of a crime. The U.S. would bring removal proceedings, and the individual would just let it ride. He wasn't going to spend $30,000 on a lawyer because he knew he wasn't going to be deported anyway. And there was this, backlog of folks, who had outstanding removal orders to be deported to Iraq that they never really fought that much in the first place, who faced indeed potential horrific human rights violations if they were returned to Iraq. And they're just going ahead and living their lives. And then, you remember the travel ban we started out with? Those majority Muslim countries which the U.S. banned immigration from? Well, one of the things that happened with that, in between version 1 and version 2, was that we cut a deal with Iraq. And we, the U.S. government, cut a deal with Iraq. And part of that deal was, okay, we'll take you off the ban list if you agree to receive deportees. And that meant that the U.S. government, in a coordinated operation, basically swooped down and arrested hundreds of people in the Detroit area, thousands of people nationwide, with outstanding removal orders to Iraq, and basically figured, well, we're going to put these guys on a plane and have them out of the country before anybody notices or has a chance to fight. It didn't actually work out that way because of some very quick work by folks in this community, by the ACLU, by the people at Code Legal Aid, some other folks who sort of ran to federal court and said, basically to the Judge Goldsmith, you've got to give these people some chance to go before an immigration judge before they're swooped out of the country. Government says, we don't need to let them go before an immigration judge. They had that chance. They got a removal order 20 years ago. We're just enforcing the 20-year-old removal order. Judge Goldsmith says, well, no. Times have changed. Things are different now. And we're talking about people, many of whom could be killed on their return. And in fact, as those cases one by one go before a judge, so far all of those folks have won the right to stay. But the bottom line for our purposes, I was talking about changes under the Trump administration, is that the Trump administration, or ICE under the Trump administration, is working very hard to deport as many people as possible without feeling at all restrained by the sort of equities the person's been living in the community for 30 years. He's a doctor, he's contributing, he's got a family, he's got minor kids. In the case of one particular story that I was reading about earlier today, he's got a U.S. citizen child with leukemia. Those are the sort of equities that are apparently not carrying any weight for the current administration. So in any event, it's a different world. I see I've kept you guys beyond your allotted time, since I think the library closes at 9, and we're going to be butting up against that in not too long. Yeah.
How does that affect our relationships with people who don't want to assimilate, then they go into government, they change the government policy, they change the country?
Well, that's good. So this is a whole new topic, but it relates in part to stuff I was talking about a little earlier, which is when you've got 11 million people in the country without authorization, how do you do law enforcement? And I don't mean law enforcement of the laws those folks are said to have violated. I mean, how do you prevent crimes being committed against them? And a whole lot of state and local police have answered that question by saying, you know what? We're not the immigration police. The immigration police can be the immigration police. But we want people who are unauthorized to know that if somebody breaks into their house, if somebody assaults them sexually, whatever it is, they can come to the police and get law enforcement. So we're not going to be involved with immigration enforcement. We don't want those people to think of us as La Migra. This has led to a fairly large conflict between those state and local law enforcement forces and the federal government that says, who is basically saying, or specifically the Justice Department and Department of Homeland Security, saying that we need to know that you're on our side and we're going to withhold federal money from you unless we're convinced that you're on our side. States and cities have been saying in return, well, you know, this is yet another thing that the Trump administration, that you guys are trying to do unilaterally. Congress never authorized you to withhold that federal money. We're doing all of the things that the law says we need to get that federal money. If you want federal money to be conditioned on our being the immigration police, go to Congress and have them enact that into law. And so far, the states and cities have been winning on that argument, although, again, like everything else, this is going to be playing out further.